Hello and welcome to the Snickerdoodle Knits YouTube channel. I am Jessica, the knitter and designer behind Snickerdoodle Knits. In this video, I am going to demonstrate how to perform a sewn bind-off. This bind-off uses a darning needle instead of using your knitting needle, and we will essentially thread the yarn through our stitches in a manner that binds off those stitches. And this just creates a more unique bind-off effect. So to get started, you want to cut your tail, of course once you've finished your work and you're ready for your bind-off, cut your tail such that it measures about 5 times the length of your bind-off. So if you were, say you were knitting flat and you only had this amount, you would measure out your yarn. This would be one length and then multiply that by 5. And since we're knitting in the round, we want it 5 times the length of our circumference. So the way that I do that is I just lay out my yarn, the length of the stitches. So that's 1. And then I double that over. So that there is the full length of the circumference, because that would bring me around one side and around the other side. So then I continue to fold the yarn so that I then have 5 lengths of that original length. So there we have 2, and 3, 4, 5, and I have just a little bit left. I basically just worked this project until I had enough yarn, so that's why I don't need to cut off my tail. But what you would do is you would measure out that 5 times your length and then cut your yarn right there at that 5 times length. That just makes sure that you don't have a whole ton of yarn that you have to thread through your stitches. So now we will go ahead. This is our last stitch that we worked. So this is the beginning of our bind off here. We'll have that facing us. And then let's go ahead and thread the yarn through our darning needle. And to start with, you can go ahead and bring quite a bit of that yarn across the front. So it's doubled up so you don't have quite as much length to bring through. So to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to take our darning needle and we're going to insert into the first stitch as if we were to purl. So like if we were using a knitting needle and we were going to purl, we would bring it through from the top of that stitch down through the front. And we will actually go through the first 2 stitches that way. So go through the first 2 stitches purl-wise and pull the yarn through. And then we're going to go through the first stitch knitwise. So that's just coming from the bottom of the stitch going up. And then we slide off that first stitch that we just went through. So now we've bound off 1 stitch. And then we continue that until we have just 1 stitch left. So purl through the first 2 stitches. Or thread it through purl-wise. Go ahead and move this needle back so it's not catching my yarn. There we go. So go through purl-wise and go through knit-wise. And when you're pulling your yarn, you don't want to strangle it, you don't want it super tight. But you also, if it's too loose, it's going to really start to curl and stuff. So try to match the tension of your stitches that you already have. So as you start to work through, you can kind of just watch and see how that tension is comparing to your work. If it's really tightening it up or if it's really loosening it. So we'll go ahead and go through purl-wise through the first 2 stitches on the needle. And then we go knitwise through the first one and push that off. So what I like to do just to save a little bit of time, is I'll go ahead and do purlwise through the first two, knitwise through the first one, and then, you know, typically you would slide that off, but just to save myself some time, I tend to just keep going. So let's pretend that one's off, then I purl through the next two stitches and do a knitwise through that, what would be that first one, and then that first one would be slipped off, so then you go purlwise through the next two stitches and knitwise through the first one that you just went through, and then go purlwise starting with the second stitch from what you just worked. So I guess an easy way to keep track of where you are is you see this yarn is coming out of this stitch. So we know our next purl will start with the next stitch. It will go through two stitches, and then we'll go through the first of those two stitches in here. So that's the one we would have just pushed off. Go through the next two stitches purlwise, and then knitwise through what would be the first one, and then go through the next two stitches. So these would all be bound off. Go through the next two stitches purlwise, and then knitwise through the first one, through the next two stitches purlwise, knitwise through the first one. And I'll go ahead and continue this till the end of this needle, and I'll show you how I then deal with it. Alright, so now I'm to the last two stitches on this needle. So I'll purl two through those, do knit one through the next one. So now I can slide off all of the stitches except for the last one. The last one I did the purl two through, but I haven't done a knit one through that. So I'll slide off all but the last stitch. And the reason I can slide all those off at the same time is just because I really did that bind off while they were still in the needle. And then I'm going to pull my needle through just because I'm working magic loop. And now that stitch will just be part of the other side. And we will continue to work the same way to the end of this needle. So purl two through the first two, purlwise through the first two, knit through the first one, and again you can choose to go ahead and slide that stitch off, or you could just leave it on like I was doing at the end of that last needle. And here my one strand of my thread, my yarn, is starting to get longer than the other, so I'm just going to pull it so that the double up isn't quite overlapping, and go through the first one, purl through two, knit through the first one, and so on. And I'll continue this till, I'll just do it until the last three, and I'll show you the last three. It's just the last stitch that's a little bit different. Alright, now we're to the last 4 stitches, so we purl two through those first two, knit one, then you can slide that one off if you want, or I'm just leaving the one for right now. Purl two, knit one, purl through two, then knit through the first one. So if you're following original instructions, you would just slid off that second to last stitch. So now we just have one stitch left, and all you have to do is purlwise through that stitch and slide that stitch off. Now you've completed your bind off, but you'll notice that there's a little bit of a gap here from where you started your bind off, right here, where you finished it. So I kind of just like to thread my tail through that first stitch there, and just close it up like that, and then I would weave in my end. So that is the sewn bind off. And when you block it, when you wet block it, just soak your item in water and then lay it flat to dry. This will start to flatten out a bit, but you can also see where it's looser, it curls a bit more, and like where it's tighter, like here at the very beginning, it lays a bit flatter. So just keep that in mind depending on what look you want. For the project that I was working on, I wanted a little bit of curl, so I wanted to have it relatively loose, but here you can see that's a nice tidy bind off as well when it's a little bit tighter. So that's your personal preference, but that's how you can adjust it, is just each time you take off a stitch, how tightly you're pulling that tail. So there you go. That is the sewn bind off. I hope you found this video helpful and informative and easy to follow. If you have questions, go ahead and replay this video at a slower speed. And if you still have questions, leave your questions in the comments below and I'll be happy to address those. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit the thumbs up and subscribe to Snickerdoodle Knits YouTube channel for additional knitting content like this. I provide knitting video tutorials for techniques as well as overviews of each of my pattern designs. So I hope to see you around. Happy knitting!